So let's turn to the book of Nehemiah. And as we were saying yesterday, originally Ezra, Nehemiah would have been one book. And either when the Old Testament was translated into Greek or even much later on, these two were separated into two books. But they are set at roughly the same historical moment. So the people of God have been in exile for 70 years, just as Jeremiah prophesied. Daniel, do you remember when during the time of the exile, whilst he was based in the court of the king, read the prophecy of Isaiah, did some mental arithmetic, worked out that 70 years were due. And so we have Daniel's prayer, in which he is praying for God to keep his word, that it would be 70 years of exile and then the return. And we have a return then after 70 years from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And that return takes place over three stages. The first stage, as we saw in the book of Ezra, is under the leadership of Zerubbabel. He's a member of the royal family. He leads the first contingent back to Jerusalem. And the focus for Zerubbabel is on the rebuilding of the temple. And so we saw yesterday the second temple is ultimately rebuilt in Jerusalem. Then you get the second wave of returnees from Babylon, and they are under the leadership of Ezra. And Ezra brings this contingent of Jewish people back, and the focus of Ezra's ministry is on the community, on the faithfulness of the community and the spiritual life of the community, the well-being of the community. He's focused particularly on the intermarriage that had taken place. And so he calls the people to separate from the non-Jewish wives, and he rededicates the people back to God. So that's the ministry of Ezra. Now, what we're going to do is look at the ministry of Nehemiah. Nehemiah will lead the third wave of returnees from Babylon to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah's focus is on the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And we are much more familiar with the story of Nehemiah than we are with the story of Ezra. The story of Nehemiah has got great appeal. It has great resonance for us as God's people. So I guess we will be more used to it. So what I want to do is what we always do, and that's take a look at the structure of the book of Nehemiah before we come down to look at some specifics. So the book itself is usually thought of as falling into three parts. And the first part is known as the first memoir, because Nehemiah speaks in the first person. And we have the first memoir of Nehemiah from chapter 1 and verse 1. And it extends into chapter 7 and verse 3. And during this time, the wall is completed. It's a first-person account of Nehemiah's experiences. And it begins with Nehemiah in Babylon, in the capital city of Susa. And he's there as the cupbearer to the king. And you need to be making connections, okay? Here is Nehemiah as a cupbearer. He's in a position of authority to Artaxerxes, the king, and he's able to use his influence with the king for good. And so if you take a look at the first chapter, Nehemiah is this high dignitary in the empire, and he receives a delegation one day from Jerusalem. So don't forget now, there have been two waves of returnees back to Jerusalem, and there's still traffic between them and Babylon. So Nehemiah has a delegation come to him. Look at verse 2 of chapter 1. Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, how are things? And what happens is Nehemiah receives a disturbing report about the situation back in Jerusalem. He's told of how awful the situation is back home, of the great distress of the people in Jerusalem, and of the reproach that they are experiencing from their enemies. That report is in verse 3 of chapter 1. And then from verse 4 down to verse 11, you have the first of the great praise that we find in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah, verse 4, sits down, he hears these words, he sits and weeps for many days, fasts and prays before the God of heaven, and then his prayer opens up. Now, what seems to have happened is, during the days of fasting and weeping, Nehemiah comes up with a plan. And his plan is to ask the king for authorization to go back to Jerusalem, to go back in the capacity as governor, and to oversee Jerusalem and Judah, and to bring about reforms and restoration. So this is Nehemiah's plan. He then, in the prayer, commits himself to God and commends his plan. And then right at the end of verse 11 of chapter 1, we discover for the first time that Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. So the plan seems to come first. He wants to go back to Jerusalem to do what he can, and then he commits himself to God. Chapter 2, you have Nehemiah acting as cupbearer, and very, very important verse 1 and 2, Nehemiah is sad in the presence of the king. Now that is a forbidden. You must not, in the presence of the great kings, show any displeasure, any unhappiness. It's a reflection on them if you do. Just being in the presence of these great kings was supposed to transform you into raptures of joy. So here's Nehemiah deliberately looking sad, and he's risking a great deal in so doing. And the king, verse 2 of chapter 2, said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." And he becomes dreadfully afraid. Nehemiah is taking this great risk. He wants the king to notice. He wants the king to inquire so that he can then share with the king his concerns and his plan. But it's a great risk, because the king may not have inquired. The king instead may have just condemned him and judged him and exiled him. So Nehemiah is presented to us as very brave. And again, you need to make connections. Make connections with the whole idea of the face and how the face must look before the king. If you can think of other examples when he was stressed how important it is that the face doesn't look sad before a king. And also Nehemiah's courage in the presence of the king to draw attention to his concerns. So there's these links you need to make with other characters as the book of Nehemiah is developing. So chapter 2, the king grants Nehemiah his request, authorizes Nehemiah to go back to Jerusalem, appoints him governor, and you see that later on, and he then is able to take supplies with him from the forests to rebuild the temple and to seek the good of the children of Israel. And one of the key verses of the book is in chapter 2 and is verse 10. Because what we meet in verse 10 is a gang of two. This gang of two will be the gang of three. And these three are the bad guys in the story of Nehemiah. They oppose all that Nehemiah is doing. And you can see in verse 2 that we meet two of them. Sanballat, chapter 2, verse 10, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official. Now, these are local governors, if you like, of other regions. They hear of what Nehemiah is doing. They were deeply disturbed. And look at how interesting verse 10 is. That a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. So straight away then, we are going to meet opposition to Nehemiah's plans. The opposition comes from outside initially, but it will also come from inside. So there's two of the bad guys, and the third of the bad guys is called Gehem, and he's Arabic. If you look at verse 19 of chapter 2, here's the three bad guys in one verse. Verse 19, Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab. Now you're going to meet these three again and again as they come up with their plans, with their devices to thwart and impede Nehemiah as best they can. So we sit in the first section of the book then, the first memoirs, and Nehemiah will tell you in chapter 3 how he begins to survey the walls and then rebuild the walls, and how he encourages the people of God, stirs them up to work and to activity. And then chapter 4, you get the opposition. Chapter 4, let's read a few verses. Verse 1, so it happened, here's our bad guy, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish? Stones that are burned. And then Tobiah joined in. Whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Now there's very vivid mockery here and ridicule being put upon the people of God. But what happens next is one of the most interesting elements of the book of Nehemiah. And that is in verse 4 of chapter 4. It's not the first time we've seen this, but it's the first time I'm going to mention it to you. This memoirs is studied with insights into Nehemiah's private thoughts. We have little glimpses into his private inner world. So if you look at verse 4 of chapter 4, hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity. Now, these are Nehemiah's private thoughts. These are insights into how he felt that we wouldn't see otherwise. You see a man who's a great leader. He's very determined, but then you get these glimpses into his inner state. And if you go back to chapter 2, you get the first of them. And I guess we did mention this, didn't we? When the king notices him and he says, so I became dreadfully afraid. So to be fair to us, we did notice the first occasion. Let me show you a couple of other occasions when he does this, okay? So these little moments of insight into Nehemiah's inner life. Chapter 5 and verse 19. Remember me, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. This is after Nehemiah has overcome some opposition. He's undone the bad job that previous governors have done in the land of Judah. Previous governors had put huge burdens on the people of God, taxation and all sorts of demands. And the people were struggling under the burdens. And Nehemiah comes as governor, and he doesn't claim expenses, he doesn't tax the people, he doesn't live off them, he takes all their burdens off them. And then chapter 5, verse 19, there is his inner thought. Remember me, my God, according to all that I have done for the people. You see exactly the same in chapter 6 and verse 14, when there's a conspiracy, again from our three bad guys. They conspire against him. They can see how well the work is going, the rebuilding of the wall, the gaps in the wall are being filled. People are there working on the wall, do you remember, with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. They are rebuilding and on the lookout for the enemies. So Sanballat and Geshem and so on, they want to go up to Jerusalem to torment the people and to mock them. Now, look at verse 14 of chapter 6. And here's another one of those moments when we come into the inner world of Nehemiah. Verse 14, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. It's the most wonderful thing. It's a very unusual thing in terms of the Old Testament record, that we see an outward view of a very confident man, somebody who's trusting in God and leading the people of God very well. But then you have moments of fear, moments of anxiety, moments when he's asking God to remember him. And what we'll see in a moment is some of the most poignant of those moments in the experience of Nehemiah. So this is the first section then of the book of Nehemiah. It's known as the first memoirs, and it takes us up to chapter 7 and verse 3 when the wall is completed. First section of Nehemiah. From chapter 7 then and verse 4 all the way through to chapter 13 and verse 3, you have the second section of the book of Nehemiah. And this second section of the book is known as the history of the people. It's focusing on the people themselves and what happens, the work that they do, the covenant that they make, the sealing of the covenant, the people where they live, the people confessing their sins. So it's very much focused on the people. And this section is famous for chapter 8. And we're going to end on chapter 8, okay? So keep a finger in chapter 8. We'll come back to that chapter and look at its significance in a moment or two. But 7 through to 13, that's the middle section, the history of the people. Now, what we then have to close the book of Nehemiah is the second memoir. And this is a much briefer memoir. What has happened is that Nehemiah has gone back to Babylon. He promised originally, the king, that he would go to Jerusalem. He'd only be there for a certain length of time, and then he would return to Babylon to be at the king's side. So Nehemiah's gone back, and he hears about what's happening back home. And so Nehemiah goes a second time back to Jerusalem. Chapter 13. And if we take a look at verse 6, the actual memoir starts at verse 4, but take a look at verse 6. Nehemiah 13 and verse 6. But during all this, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days, I obtained leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem, and this is the second time now, and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah. Now, what had happened is this fella Eliashib, in Nehemiah's absence, had given one of the bad guys his own room in the temple. This guy, what's his name? Tobiah. He had been given access into the most sacred thing, the temple in Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah hears of it. He comes back to Jerusalem. He clears it all out. You can see there, verses 8 and 9 of chapter 13. It grieved me bitterly. Therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room, and I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. And this is the first reform now that Nehemiah makes on his second stint in Jerusalem. He cleans the temple, he then sorts out the Levites, and then he gives his attention to the Sabbath day. And he discovers that the Sabbath was being broken regularly. There was a huge amount of trading going on. There was all this back and forth into the city on the Sabbath day when they bring their goods on their donkeys, and there were people outside of Jerusalem camping outside, bringing their wares into Jerusalem. And you see all this in verse 15 of chapter 13. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre were there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. And so there's Nehemiah now. He picks a fight with the nobles and says, this mustn't go on. God will bring disaster on us again. And so Nehemiah brings his final reform. He closes the gates on the Sabbath, and he forbids all this trade on the Sabbath. And that's the second ministry, the second period of Nehemiah's rule in Jerusalem. Now, don't forget, Nehemiah's not royal. He's not a priest. He's not a prophet. He's none of those things. But what you see in this final chapter are more examples of this insight into Nehemiah's private world. Look at verse 14. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services. And then you get two more such occasions. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important these little windows are into Nehemiah's inner world. It's a world that's in stark contrast to the outward Nehemiah, who stands up to mockery, who tells the lords of the people that they need to change their behavior, who is very certain and confident. Look again at the last chapter, chapter 13, verse 22. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. And then the last word in the book of Nehemiah, verse 31. Remember me, O my God, for good. Now, I probably used this word already, but let's use it again. These are very poignant insights, because what we are discovering about Nehemiah isn't the fact that he has anxiety and he has uncertainty, but it's also an insight into his thoughts in relationship to God. He is thinking about God. Remember me, O God. Remember me, O my God. The word remember is a very special word because it's linked to the covenant. It's like when God remembered Noah. It's an appeal for God to keep his covenantal promises. It's an ask, God, be faithful to me according to your word. But of course, what we have in all these moments is no sense of certainty at all. Nehemiah is not certain of his relationship to God, of his standing with God. He lacks what you and I would call assurance. And so he's pleading and he's asking and he's saying, remember me, and he's even offering up his works. But the major idea here is, how much assurance can an Old Testament saint have? How sure can an Old Testament believer be of his or her standing with God, that is something that he can be confident of? And to what extent is assurance something that belongs to the new covenant and new covenant believers? That's what I want you to reflect on from these wonderful moments into the life of Nehemiah. So let's end then with chapter 8. And chapter 8, verses 1 through to 12, is a radical departure to everything that's gone before. And it's hugely, hugely significant. So I hope you bear with me now if I read these verses to you, okay, and get some sense of how important these verses are. Nehemiah 8, verse 1. Now all the people gathered together as one man in the open square that was in front of the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. which the Lord had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men and women, and all who could hear with understanding, so that's children, on the first day of the 7th month. Then he read from it in the open square that was in front of the water gate, from morning till midday, before the men and women and those who could understand. Look how that's repeated. And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. So Ezra the scribe stood on a platform of wood, which they had made for this purpose. And beside him stood, and there's a list. Verse 5, Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was standing above all the people when he opened it. All the people stood up. Then Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God. Then all the people said, Amen, while lifting up their hands. They bowed their heads and worshipped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And then you got that list of assistants again. If you look at verse 7, they helped the people to understand the law, and as the people stood in their place. So they read distinctly from the book in the law of God, and they gave the meaning and helped the people to understand the reading. And then Nehemiah, who was the governor, Ezra the priest and the scribe, the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep. For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. And then he dismisses the congregation. Now, why is that hugely important? And that passage is important for two reasons. This gives rise to what we noted in Ezra yesterday. This gives rise to what will eventually become the synagogue tradition. People meeting together, having the law brought to them, reading the law out, and having the law explained. We have, do you remember the phrase? We have here what's known as Second Temple Judaism. The temple is small. It's not big enough to do the job. It's not big enough to hold vast congregations. So people begin to meet in their villages and in their towns, and they follow the pattern that's laid down here for them under the ministry of Nehemiah and Ezra the scribe. And the focus of that pattern is worship, the reading of scripture, the expounding of scripture, and prayer. Now, it's not going to take a lot to work out, is it? That what you get here is the model for church life. This model that goes into synagogue worship, and you see the importance of the synagogue when Jesus goes into Nazareth and he takes the book of Isaiah and he reads from the book of Isaiah and he says to the congregation, this day, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. He's reading from Isaiah. That's based on this here. What Jesus does in the synagogue flows directly from this wonderful occasion in the life of Nehemiah. So it becomes the model for the synagogue. And then ultimately, it's taken up by Peter and Paul, and it becomes the model for church life. And if you just look at it, it's as clear as day. You've even got a pulpit, haven't you, in this model. They build a platform for him, verse 7, which they had made for the purpose. And verse 5, Ezra opened the book in the sight of all people, for he was standing above all the people. He's 6 foot above contradiction here as he opens the Bible and he expounds it. And because this congregation is so great, then not everybody can hear. So these assistants, they go out into the congregation and then they apply the scriptures, they open up the scriptures, they tell its meaning to different sections of the congregation. It's the pattern for church life. And what's really interesting is there's no Sunday school, is there? It's for men and for women and for those who could understand. The age of understanding. When does a child reach the age of understanding? Well, they stay into the congregation here, and they become part of the life of the congregation. And they then take part in this whole idea of worship. So this is hugely important, and it marks a really auspicious occasion that is continuing down even to our day. The model that Nehemiah and Ezra put together here on this occasion. And on this occasion, you have one of the great verses of our Bibles. So the congregation are going to be dismissed. Verse 10, chapter 8 and verse 10, go your way. They're going to have a feast, eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. So either those who had to stay at home or those who are poor. For this day is holy to the Lord our God. Then here it is. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Now that's a hugely wonderful verse. And quite rightly, this verse has been reflected on and thought about over the centuries. And there's two ideas in this verse. The people of God are weak. They're in a very weak position here. You've seen the three bad guys. There's opposition. There's ruins. There's struggle. They've rebuilt the temple. They've rebuilt the walls. But they, as we said yesterday, they'll never be independent again. They are a weak few. So where will they find strength? And what Nehemiah says very clearly is the people will always find strength in God. The people of God find their strength in God. And what he says is this: the joy of the Lord is your strength. Finding joy in God isn't something we've got to kind of make up. We haven't got to even decide, well, what is it then? What is this joy? The answer is in chapter 8. The joy of the Lord is his word, understanding his word. The joy of the Lord is worship. The joy of the Lord is fellowship. The joy of the Lord is prayer. But overwhelmingly, the joy of the Lord is the understanding of his scripture. And the more you understand, the more you apply, the more you give, the more attention that is placed upon the scripture, the more the joy of the Lord is experienced, and then the more strength, the more strengthened, I guess, the people of God are. So if you look at verse 11, so the Levites quieted all the people, saying, be still, for the day is holy, do not be grieved. They were initially grieved because the book of the law, of course, told them about their sins and the judgment of God on their sins. So they were grieved and distressed. But what the scribes had to do, and Ezra had to do, and Nehemiah had to do, was to say, look, that's not the end of the story. Our sin is not the end of the story. It's the gracious God. It's the Redeemer God. It's he who is our Lord. That is the end of our story. So do not sorrow. You know, there's that emphasis in verses 10 and 11. Do not sorrow over our sins, but instead it's the joy of the Lord. It's who God is, and it's the graciousness of our God that is the key thing. And a very small point, I think, is what you see here in this pattern that is then taken up in the life of the church, is you must always send God's people away happier than when they first came. You know, you don't go to church in order to come away feeling worse. And how many times have you and I gone and we've been told about our sins, and we've been told about our failures, and we've been told about our mistakes, and we've been told about our weaknesses, and so on, and we end up feeling worse. We're grieved at the end. This pattern here is really important. Today is holy. Today is the Lord. Rejoice in him. The joy of your Lord is your strength. So verse 12, all the people went their way to eat and drink, to send portions and rejoice greatly. And here's the key again, as if if you've missed it, here it is again. Where's the joy of the Lord found? They understood the words that were declared to them. The joy of the Lord is found in understanding his word and discovering God through his word. So that's the book of Nehemiah. And I'm sure all of us have read this book many times. We leave the book of Nehemiah there.